Now, I want you to understand as we get into this that the story of American history, which most of you have some degree of familiarity with, runs parallel to the story of the American United Methodist Church. All right? By the way, the term united got thrown in 1968 when there was a merger between the Ecumenical United Brethren and the Methodist Church. The Brethren had a similar theological track, similar organizational track, similar historical track. They were much smaller than the Methodist Church. But the merger was a logical and happy celebration. In 1968, I wasn't born yet, but I do remember that Gaston Foote was the pastor at First Methodist downtown Fort Worth, where we resided. Oddly enough, Gene Traster's son-in-law, Dale Schultz, who is now Dr. Dale Schultz and the pastor of St. Paul United Methodist Church in Hurst, was in my second grade Sunday school class at First Methodist in downtown Fort Worth, which my mother and dad were teachers in. It was their experience there that motivated them to leave and go to Ridgely United Methodist Church, simply because First Fort Worth was so big. They wanted a place that was a little bit more relational. That's just some trivia. But that's where the United Methodist Church came from. The history we're going to talk about precedes the word united, and we're talking about the Methodist Church. I want you to be aware that I have many references in my office, most of which are pretty dated. The internet can give you a wealth of information. They can fill in some of the gaps that I won't be able to cover all of during this 5-week period. UMC.org. That's easy enough to remember. Just go there. They've got all sorts of resources on history, polity, organizational stuff. That's where this timeline that I've given you has come from today that is too small for you to read. That actually is a technique that we use when we want to control how much information gets out. But anyway, UMC.org will be a great resource for you. But let me just give you a little verbal history. John Wesley is known as the father of Methodism. He didn't do it single-handedly, but he was the single most force-driving presence. Closely behind him was his brother Charles. John Wesley was born in 1703. Charles, his brother, was born in 1707. They were 2 of 17 children of their parents, Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Personality-wise, John Wesley was the more intellectual, academically, cerebrally oriented fellow. His brother Charles was more of the feeler, more of the artistic, more of the creative presence. Therefore, they became a great team. They needed each other. John always kind of took the lead, but Charles was not far behind. If you ever get bored when I'm preaching, take one of the hymnals out from under the blue chair and look in the index, and you'll see that Charles Wesley wrote an awful lot of the hymns that are mainstays in traditional Methodist worship. Now, of course, we've expanded over the years. We have a whole new contemporary praise, however you wish to describe it. It's done as well here at St. John the Apostle as any place I've ever experienced, because the music is such quality. It's not the same thing, sung over and, "O Father, we adore you," sung 24 times. Not 7-11 music, 7 words sung 11 times. Or as some say, G-Zac music. It's quality music. And under John Rand's leadership, our wonderful praise band, they just do an incredible job. Everybody that comes here is impressed. I tell them our church is spoiled and complacent. We take for granted what we have. And I think there's some truth to that. But a lot of the traditional stuff, Charles Wesley was very much a part of. Now, the parents of these 17 children and these 2 boys, John and Charles, were Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Samuel was an Anglican priest. That is the Church of England during this period of time. Now go back in your American history. When did Christopher Columbus sail for the New World? 1492. So we're dealing with a couple of hundred years after that. And there has been exploration of this new world and many journeys by many people and explorers who have come to take a look at what was inhabited by Indians, but what the Europeans described as virgin lands. As people began to set sail from England and Europe to the New World, this is on the American history side, what was their motivation for doing so? Beyond just an entrepreneurial or curious spirit. What else motivated them? All right, I'm hearing several things. Somebody said religion. Why was it religion? Okay. It's common in American history that we learned that the Anglican Church had become very heavy-handed in the culture. And there were many people in Europe that felt that the line of separation between church and state had been crossed. Religion had become highly judgmental, it had become highly legalistic. And when you look at the history of the Protestant church, it all goes back to the Protestant Reformation. Now, I want to stay with the outline so I don't throw John off track. Understand that the Anglican Church is a mixture of Catholicism and Protestantism. And if you go way back in Christian history, there was a time back in 1510, 1520, where the Catholic Church, which then was the Catholic meaning universal, it was the only faith expression. When we recite the Apostles' Creed and say, I believe in the Catholic Church, the C is not capitalized. If it were capitalized, we'd be talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Catholic in its origin linguistically refers to one and only or universal. And so we as United Methodists believe in the church universal, even though we prefer the faith expression. But before that, there was the Roman Catholic Church, and there was a time of great corruption. There was the selling of indulgences. Anybody know what that means? Tell us, Cathan. Right. Confession was and still is an important part of the Roman Catholic expression. I think it should be important for us. Confession is just good for the soul. The Bible tells us if we confess our sins, He's faithful and just and will cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Confession is a sign of humility and dependence, and it's sacramental in the Catholic Church. Well, in addition to the corruption of politics and control and misuse of power, the priesthood had adopted this idea of selling these indulgences. And so I go to my priest and I say, well, and I'm using a contemporary analogy for an historic example, I cheated on my taxes this year. I ripped off the government and the IRS. And the priest says, well, in the name of the Lord Jesus, you're forgiven. If. That's where the problem came in. And a financial contribution was required, called an indulgence. Not everybody knew where that financial contribution went. Did it go to line the pockets of the priest, the parish the priest was serving? Did it go to the Catholic Church? Did it go to missions? But people began to protest these types of practices as corrupt and self-serving and incongruent with the theology that was offered in Jesus, that was freedom from the legalism and the conditional nature of the Jewish church that He had His roots in that wound up crucifying Him. So the Protestant Reformation began to occur starting formally in 1517 when Martin Luther, now we have a Methodist church based on John Wesley. The Lutheran faith expression is based on Martin Luther, the first big Protestant expression, and he nailed his 95 Theses or his 95 protests to a Catholic church door and brought world attention, as much attention as you could get in the world during that day. And the Protestant Reformation was not a short-term experience. The Protestant Reformation was an attempt to reform the Catholic Church and draw it back into line with its historic roots. And as ego and power and accomplishment and resistance, all of that worked into chemistry, the Catholic Church did learn and grow. But there was also a new Christian expression known as Protestantism, which started in Lutheranism and over the next several hundred years emerged into a variety of faith expressions. And you know from our more modern Methodist history during your lifespan and mine that up until about 18 or so years ago, the so-called mainline Protestants held the bulk of the Protestant world. The independent church, the Bible church, the non-denominational church, the interdenominational church, they didn't really come about until the 80s, and they took off in the 1990s. And now they have become the most active and influential Protestant expression in our society today. The mainline denominations are dying. It goes back to the question about the future of the Methodist Church. We're in trouble, and we got to be careful, and we've got to be faithful, because you will learn, I hope, in this series, we have a remarkable, fresh, relevant, Christ-centered theological expression. But anyway, the Protestant Reformation is well underway and back to social again in the English world. There is heavy rebellion against certain aspects now of the Anglican Church during this period of the 1700s. Say 1717, which is on the screen. This is what Samuel and Susanna are experiencing in their parish known at a place called Epworth. Epworth was not the most inspiring place outside of London at the time. It was blue collar, a lot of cloudy days, a lot of rain. And the blue collar people then, just as they are now, are not real concerned with pretense and image. We know as pastors, if you go to a blue collar church, people are going to tell you what they think. You're going to know where they stand. They're going to be very upfront. They're going to be very direct. And if they don't like it, you're going to hear about it. And you're going to hear about why they don't like it. And they may not always have some of the tools of sophistication to package politically what they're saying. But they're ferociously loyal. And they're honest. And what you see is what you get. White collar settings won't always let you know what people are thinking. They'll murmur about it more amongst themselves. They'll talk about it rather than to it. And when they do address it, they often deal with it in such polished, politically correct ways that they don't indicate how serious the problem may be. And then when they act on it, people are upset because there's a sense of politics or hypocrisy with it. Epworth was a blue-collar community, and these people were not happy. And they regarded Wesley as an example, Samuel Wesley, as the extension of the Anglican Church. They were too meddling, they were too intrusive, they were too controlling, and there was a rebellious spirit. The Wesleys, Samuel and Susanna, and all 17 children lived in what was called a rectory. Okay, do you know what that is? It's the home that is owned by the church that the minister who comes to you will live in. I live in one of those. It's called a parsonage. I love to go out to eat, and when the server talks about condiments, I say, oh no, I live in a church-owned parsonage. Some of them get it, some of them don't. Most of you didn't. Don Fowler did, okay? Condominium, condiment, parsonage, that's the cornball line. That's called dry wit. Anyway, I live in a church-owned parsonage. Oddly enough, nowadays in the Methodist world, most larger churches don't have a parsonage anymore. They offer what's called a housing allowance. It's just a sum of money that the church offers, and the minister buys their own home. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both ways. For me, it's irrelevant. St. John the Apostle has, to me, a beautiful parsonage, 2,000 square feet, close enough to the church to be convenient, far enough away to be private, modern home. I couldn't afford to live in a home like that. I'm very grateful to have it. We'll talk about the pros and cons of that some other day. But the rectory is where the Wesleys were living. And in this rebellious spirit of anger, somebody set the rectory on fire. It was a case of arson. And John Wesley survived the fire, as did his family, by a very close call, to use nursery rhyme language, by the hair of their chinny chin chin. It scared them to death and let them know in no uncertain terms that it was not an easy time to be in ministry for the Anglican Church. Now, to pause here for a minute and preach a little bit, I can't resist the urge. As we deal with challenging times in our culture regarding United Methodism, mainline denominations, and all of Christianity, remember, this is not the first challenge. Christianity has had its ups and downs, its challenges, ever since the time of Jesus. And so there is hope in this, if we'll learn from it, be faithful and smart. The end is not near. It is going to be a different world, and we have to adjust to that. Well, that's one of these times here. And it was during this time that Samuel Wesley felt led to approach his son John, again, one of 17 children, about the idea of following in his footsteps in the Anglican Church and making his dad proud, and is there a call upon his life? Well, the timing was not good after that fire and seeing the way that his wonderful parents were treated by the people at Epworth. And Wesley basically said, no, thank you. Not interested. Within himself, he may have been saying, hell no, I'm not going to put up with this kind of stuff. I'll find honest work where there is a sense of reward to the investment we make. But Wesley declined. But what we see historically is God was very much at work in John Wesley. And there was a tug. It's kind of like Marc Lowrance. I knew from my high school days that ministry could well be in my future. But because of my fear of the academic side of the world of ministry, I thought maybe it was something I would do in my retirement years. Well, I'm almost there. But I wound up doing it a lot sooner, but I didn't jump in right away. I was an undergraduate broadcast major at TCU, went into broadcasting, taught school for 5 years, stayed in broadcasting longer than that, and those were the years that God used to really close in on me. And I went to seminary then, and I've lied about my age so much, I've forgotten how old I was then and now for that matter, but that was the progression going into ministry. Wesley had a similar journey. He went on to Oxford to study other things, but scratched the itch of ministry by forming a little group of guys known as the Holy Club. And the Holy Club was designed as an expression of compassion and service. They did good deeds for people. The elderly who needed help in the community. They reached out to the impoverished and the poor. And I want you to know right now that dealing with poverty and the poor was, always has been, and still is a hallmark of our United Methodist faith expression. Wesley went to the bars and the night spots, and entered into a relationship, as did other members of the Holy Club, with individuals who might be living in emptiness and brokenness. They visited prisons. They visited the local jails. They visited all sorts of care centers and hospitals. They were very socially oriented. And this became a very consuming thing. It was very rewarding for Wesley and for the other guys in the Holy Club. One of the young men in the Holy Club was kind of a frail little fellow. I don't know enough history to know why, but he was not as robust physically as a lot of the other young men in their late teens and early 20s, and his name was William Morgan. And William Morgan was as taken by this Holy Club endeavor as anybody, and was working to the point of exhaustion to keep his studies at Oxford going and keep all of his commitments to the Holy Club underway. And it began to impact his physical health, and he got sick. And he stayed sick, and he couldn't get well, and he tragically died. And so you hear of a tragic death of a young man at about 20 or 21 years old who dies, and there are serious questions about his death, just as there is shock and grief. Leading the charge, understandably, of those in shock and grief are William Morgan's father. And William Morgan's father blames John Wesley and the Holy Club for the death of his son. You drove him, you pushed him, you brainwashed him, you forced this into him in ways that he was not physically able to handle, and he got sick because of this, and he filed a lawsuit in the English court to sue the Holy Club, blaming them for the death of his son. A reasonable argument from a practical perspective, and a very understandable response from a grieving father. This was a turning point for John Wesley, who was the head man of the Holy Club, because it forced John Wesley at a very young age. We're talking about a man the age of my oldest son in college up at Evansville, Indiana, to have to defend his faith and all that the Holy Club stood for. And Wesley had to go to work. And remember, I said he was the more cerebral and intellectual of the two brothers, John and Charles. So Wesley wound up exceeding with this endeavor. He did very well with it. And he made an entire long multi-page document that explained who William Morgan was, what motivated him to take an interest in the Holy Club, how much he loved what he was doing, what a spark and motivating source of life the Holy Club was for William Morgan, and how it was his motivation out of gratitude and excitement that motivated everything he did and gave him this drive to be an overachiever. And nothing was ever forced on him. There was never any brainwashing. There was never any consequence or demand. He did it because he wanted to. He did it because he loved it. The document was so well written and so well described, William Morgan, that when his daddy read it, his daddy melted and began to process his overwhelming grief for the death of his son in more healthy ways, and he dropped his lawsuit against the Holy Club. This lawsuit led us to a foundation that has now been laid for everything that's going to follow in the future of the Methodist expression, and that is we are a gratitude-based faith expression. And Lord knows, loved ones, if you haven't heard that preached from this pulpit for the years that St. John the Apostle has been alive, from Jerry Chisholm on through Marc Lawrence, I don't know where your ears have been. We don't motivate out of scaring people. We don't motivate out of manipulating people, unless it's certain individuals like Well, we won't mention those. We don't use guilt. We don't use hellfire and damnation. We talk about consequences. We talk about consequences of behavior that's unbecoming to being a follower of Christ. We talk about all sorts of things. Choices have consequences. But it's all based out of a sense of gratitude for God's love, God's favor, God's grace. Much of religion has been an attempt to earn favor from God. That's why behaviors that are unbecoming that other people indulge in are so threatening to us. A gratitude-based theology says we are living out of the favor we already have in graciousness and gratitude, in the excitement of sharing the love that we have been given with other people. And that became a hallmark of the Holy Club and all of the Wesleyan expansion that would follow. As a result, in the ensuing years that happened quickly, we're talking about the next 1 to 4 years, more than one Holy Club began to develop, began to expand. And these were called the societies. The term Methodist was coined by outsiders, spectators, in some ways skeptics, because Wesley was so cerebral in his way of thinking. I mean, you can see all sorts of traits of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, that they got coined Methodists because they had methods for everything they were doing. If you ever pick up, God help you, our denominational book of discipline, you will understand how methodical we always are. We are so methodical that we're almost encumbered by the heavy weight of outdated ways of thinking and doing things. Our modern church is giving us some freedom even within the discipline, while the denomination struggles about the discipline, to be free from some of the things. If you attended the streamlining of structure event that I hosted here last summer, where Brad Britton came from the South District of the Methodist Church, you learned that there are some new ways of staffing your church in terms of lay leadership, where you can streamline it and have fewer people involved in administration for the purpose of having more people involved in mission. And mission is how we started. Mission is where we should be all the time. We should be a mission statement. And we'll talk about the organizational structure here as we get further into the class in coming weeks. These societies are formed. Methodist, a term coined by onlookers to describe the order and structure of the day. And John Wesley is highly intellectual, and this intellectual nature, like any strength or weakness, is both a gift and a challenge. When I came out of broadcasting and went into ministry, I found people who were very impressed with my ability to speak one-to-many, organize, deliver, lead a meeting, lead a worship service, preach a sermon. But I also found some people who were very turned off by it. It was almost too much professionalism so that it seemed slick and phony. My gift, you see, was also a weakness. I had already learned some of that when I went to work in television. And after working for several weeks as a real green beginner with professional wrestling, Fritz von Erich, who owned the promotion, took me aside one day and he said, "Marc," his old gruff voice, "you sound great out there, but you look terrible. Stand in front of the mirror and make sure your facial expression matches what is coming out of your mouth, your mind, and your heart." What Fritz was saying in his not too couth way as a professional wrestler was that I was sounding very engaging, had great excitement, was very invitational, but my face was eluding arrogance. And so I had to learn to smile and use more expressions and take more time to take an interest in the people I was interviewing, because I was so worried about not making a mistake I was so focused on myself that I had to grow into that. Wesley is having that same struggle. He is so cotton-picking smart and so well organized that he is struggling in some of his relationships with others and is struggling in his own faith journey because he's having a hard time feeling his faith. It's in his head and it's in practice, but the fire of the Holy Spirit that cross and flame, is it up here? Yeah, there it is. Eludes is missing from Wesley, and we're going to talk about that and some other things as we continue our discussion next Sunday. The handout you have is a comparison chart of the United Methodist history and our American history. Now, next week, we're going to pick up there just a little ways down on the front page where John Wesley serves as a chaplain to a Georgia colony. The colonization process has begun as people are leaving England and coming overseas to the New World. And if you notice that Paul Revere was born in 1735, which is about the time all this was happening. There's Ethan Allen. Anybody ever bought any furniture from the Ethan Allen store? Okay. The Boston Tea Party is going to be down the list. Anyway, all that's on there. And other great persons who are going to be a part of the Wesleyan movement or the Methodist movement. People like Francis Asbury, Thomas Coke, Otterbein, Jacob Albright, they're going to be coming along and taking their place in the American movement of Methodism. Where did I say the rectory was located for Samuel and Susanna? Anybody ever seen Epworth United Methodist Church up on Cooper? Trish, you used to go there. You were on staff there, weren't you? Yeah. Epworth Hall at First Methodist, downtown Fort Worth. I was on the district committee of church building and location in about 2007. Now let me stop and tell you what that is. In our Methodist connectional stuff, the denomination owns all the property. That will never be an issue. We have ownership rights, we have stewardship, we have usage rights, unless we decide to get mad and leave, which is an interesting topic with some of the denominational split stuff that we'll get onto down the road. But when you are going to sell your property and relocate, or when you're going to buy a new parsonage, or you're going to sell your parsonage and start giving your pastor a housing allowance instead, or you're going to add on a new expansion to your property, you can't do that until you get approval with the denomination. And the denominational expression of that is the Church Committee on Building and Location. And they will come in and review your plans, review your financing, review your ministry vision and everything. And if you're over your head, they'll tell you, you got to slow down, you can't do it. If it looks good, they'll okay it and you're good to go. I was on that committee that went to Epworth Methodist Church here in Arlington. Epworth was struggling. It was in decline. And somebody had offered them, I think it was Starbucks, a lot of money to buy the frontage of their property on Cooper Street. Starbucks was going to open a location close to UTA, and there would be a couple of other storefronts that then would be leased out, even though the building would be owned by Starbucks. And Epworth was so excited because they could take this money and use it to upgrade their facility and pay some bills and do some things that church decline had prevented them from being able to do. There were 8 or 9 of us on the committee, and all of them voted in favor of doing that except for me. And I was the only voice that said, it's a bad decision. And I was based on the story, do you know of it, in the Hebrew Scriptures, where the guy sells his birthright because he's hungry. And his brother, Jacob and Esau, had kind of taken advantage of his impulsive nature and let him smell the aroma of the delicious concoction that was on the fire that day. A birthright was a powerful privilege of Jewish inheritance that opened the door for all sorts of privileges and power in any family circle. To give up your birthright for one meal was grotesquely questionable, if not downright stupid. And I use that analogy with Epworth. This is a very short-term gain because you are selling all of your visibility. Nobody's going to be able to see you. And you've offered no plan of evangelism or advertisement that's going to offset that. You're walling your church off from Cooper Street. Well, but we just feel like, well, the vote passed. They did it. And Epworth has done nothing but go downhill ever since. I've done a chart recently that I've shared with our Council on Ministries and our Council of Stewards. I'm going to show it to our Staff Parish Relations Committee, and I may show it in my sermon next week about the last 18 years. That would be the year 2000 through 2018, about the history of participation levels of Methodist churches in Arlington. And it's pretty doggone alarming when you see what has happened. But Epworth is on that list. We're going to try to stay ahead of that curve by being a community of grace committed to making disciples, growing deeper, and being more discipled in our orientation. And we will continue our Methodism study next week. We're going to talk in coming weeks about organization, theology, what happens in America, how we approach Scripture, answer your questions. So I hope the best is yet to come. Thank you for coming today.
Is there a book that we could go by, that we could get on Amazon, where we could follow along?
Not that I'm aware of. I just keep that outline in umc.org.